when we're talking about population, and that sinking feeling, I think, is natural. We don't know where population is going, and I think the underlying basic primal fear of everything is fear of the unknown. And so today I'm going to try and tell you something, what is known about global human population, hopefully alleviate some of those fears, that dread, that foreboding. I think when you know more about the future, you're going to have less of that fear. And I think if you really think about the population issue, and by that I mean it's the underlying number to all things bad about the world. It's it exacerbates war, famine, probably even disease, and of course climate change. Then you might think again about this feeling of foreboding. Maybe you should be optimistic about population going down. So now this is going to be a science talk, so we're going to start with data. Let's look over the last 1,000 years of human population. The last 100 years or so has been through global censuses that have been happening every 10 years in almost every country. And before that, these are numbers put together by historians. And those numbers, the last 100 years, are accurate to within about 3%, going further back, maybe accurate to about 10%. And they tell an interesting story. Starting at about 1,000, the year 1000, the doubling time in population was about 700 years. In 1803, the population doubled from 500 million to 1 billion, so the doubling time shortened to 260 years. In 1928, it went to 2 billion, so that's a doubling time of 125 years. And then in 1987, it went from 2.5 billion in 1950 to 5 billion in 1987, a doubling time of 37 years. So not only has population been growing, it's been growing increasingly fast over the years. This is not your normal exponential growth. If I now plot exponential growth on the slide, I see it doesn't really fit. And it's not just an issue of scaling. It doesn't fit the accelerated growth that we've had. You can try fitting it to other equations and it fits better. It actually fits a hyperbola, and then a paper in 1960 called the Doomsday Equation fit it to a hyperbola. I didn't try that, it didn't make any sense. But I did fit it to a hyper exponential curve, and that's this one. And that fits recent population, but not more older population data. But if you mix the two, you get something that fits all the data pretty well. So now we have an equation that fits population. It's not the standard e to the x, where x is the rate of growth. It's something like e to the x that is some crazily fast growth rate. It's where the rate itself is growing exponentially. Now it's actually something, it's not quite that. It's e to the x plus e to the y, really. It's a combination of exponential and hyper-exponential. So what is that about? Well, I think some of you know, you from the degrowthers out there realize that technology is driving population growth. And technology is an animal that seems to grow intrinsically. And so if something that's growing intrinsically is proportional to the rate of growth, you get hyper-exponential growth. And that's the explanation I will use as a starting point of a model for this for population growth. If you think about it, technology increases life expectancy, increases food production, increases intrinsically, that is, technology itself grows in proportion to technology. It increases the carrying capacity of the planet, and later we'll look at how technology can cause problems, which can cause population to turn the other direction. So once you have an equation that fits the data, and you have an explanation for that equation, then the equation's justified, then what you can do is start with that and look at how it fits the data, doesn't fit the data, and work on a model, what we call a formal model, to try and predict the future. Well, it turns out hyper-exponential growth stops being a good predictor in about the 1980s. And you can see here in red is the best fit hyper-exponential growth model. In blue is the actual observed population. And in 2010, the difference between those two curves is about 2 billion individuals. So it's pretty clear that hyper-exponential growth is no longer the rule. I remember when I looked at the code for population prediction algorithms, and it was linear. And it didn't make any sense to me as a biologist that growth should be linear. There's never linear growth in biological systems. So what is that? And I thought, well, what it could be is it's kind of an inflection point in a curve curving up and then turning to a curve going down. And predictions from the United Nations of population has us at about the inflection point now. And so I think that's what it is that we think it's linear, but it's really in between an upward curve and a downward curve. In this plot, I've taken population data from countries around the world and regions around the world, and then looked at if it's at the inflection point now, and it looks, and the ones in red are regions and populations and countries that are past the inflection point, and it's hardly detectable, but those are now having some downward curvature since 2010, and the green ones are the ones that still have upward curvature. They're still accelerating. And those you can see are the least developed countries. But it points to that we are really close to a downward direction in population because the largest countries in the world are past the inflection point. So they're in this second derivative, this negative second derivative, the downward curvature regime. And here to look into it a little bit more, if you plot the US population over just the last 10 years, you can see negative curvature creeping in towards the end. And if you look at vital statistics over the last 10 years or so, starting around 2016, the birth rate started to drop more precipitously. This is world data. And the mortality rate, at least for men, has started to creep up since 2016. And so those numbers agree with these numbers that we're starting to see a change. Now the question is, where will population go? There's two models. I'm presenting the simplest models out there, the logistic growth model, which says that there exists a maximum, there exists a carrying capacity, and that we're going to asymptotically approach the carrying capacity. And the other says that we're going to exceed the carrying capacity, we're going to overshoot it, and then the population will go down. So both of these make some kind of sense, but the first one assumes the carrying capacity is a static number. The second one says that it's more of a dynamic number. So let's look at that. Well, as a biologist, I have to ascribe to the principle that humans are a case-selected species. So we're going to say population sticks to the carrying capacity. If you're not a biologist, an R-selected species is any species that just grows as fast as it can and its population is controlled by predators. And a case-selected species is a species that grows up to its carrying capacity and is not, its population is not determined by predation, but it's determined by the food supply, or in the case of trees, the light supply. And so we are a case-selected species. It's always been accepted among biologists that we're case-selected species, but it's not accepted among economists and demographers that we are a case-selected species. And so they talk about making enough food to satisfy the population. It's the wrong way to think of it. If you make more food production will mean more people, unless we graduate to a new species that is not determined by the carrying capacity. And I'm not ready to back down from my biological worldview. I think we are going to be determined by the food available. So now can we predict what's going to happen? I'll start with some of the predictions that are commonly used, the ones that predominate in any discussions of population in the mainstream media are coming from the United Nations, and these are the three ones that you'll hear, the top one being the one you hear the most. And the top one is by a guy named Wolfgang Lutz, and what he did was modeled birth rate and death rate trends, first derivative, second derivative, and then he also modeled migration, and when people migrate from one country to another, their fertility adopts to the new country, and so on. And he did this using random numbers, so he got this range of outcomes. And it said that population is going to go up to around 11 million by the end of the century. And that's the one you'll hear most. Another one by the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation came up with a prediction that's a little bit lower than that of Wolfgang Lutz, and it uses causal relationships where they look at the effect of the trends in poverty, trends in unrest, the trends even in climate on the fertility rate, and they use that that relationship to predict where the birth rate and the death rate are going to go. And then the last one is another group called the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. And what they did is they went out and asked experts, where do you think the birth rate's going to go? And they predict that at the peak in population is going to happen around 2070, and it'll be on a clear downward trend by 2100. All of these models they're absent any consideration of the environment. They only consider demographics. They look at birth rate, death rate. And maybe the experts that they're asking are considering the environment, but it's not something that's built into the model that the Earth is a finite thing. Something we know is still not built into the model. And I'm preaching on that because that's where I think we really need to go in the world of modeling. We need to look at the limits to growth. There's a book called Limits to the Growth from 1972. Anybody remember that? Paul Ehrlich. No, I'm sorry, Dennis Meadows. Paul Ehrlich's the population bomb. Sorry, Paul and Dennis. So Limits to Growth became textbook for a course I teach called Human Population. So what are the limits to growth, and are we approaching them? Let's just go through some of them. First of all, land is finite. Arable land, 38% of all the land on the earth is arable land, is largely already being plowed, already being used. Technology is being used to more and more efficiently get more food out of that land, but there's a limit. You can't go beyond 100% efficient. You can't go beyond 100% of that arable land. I flew over the US recently, took these pictures from my window seat, and I saw all the land divided up into these patches everywhere throughout the Midwest that I could see, even in spaces between the mountains. It was all being used. And it's interesting, if you look at this, you see these circles. And what those are farms that are irrigated by groundwater, using this called center pivot irrigation technology. And that is another limit to growth. Groundwater is finite because it's not necessarily being recharged at the rate that it's being depleted. The Ogallala Reservoir, or the aquifer, is underneath a large part of the Midwest, and studies on that, motivated by how long was my farm going to last, show that it's being depleted in many places. So wherever you see it going red in this image here, that's the water levels are going down. So not all aquifers are recharged at the same rate. Some of them are recharged very slowly. They're called fossil water. And that means that groundwater, is a limiting resource. And some of those circles that we saw in the image from the plane are going dry. So that's going to limit growth. Another thing, also groundwater in California are going dry faster than other places. All the red dots here are wells that are in serious depletion. So, the global outlook on groundwater is that 21 out of the 37 largest aquifers on Earth, shown in this image, are in depletion now. Groundwater. The ocean is also a limiting. I could talk about coral reefs. I could talk about pH. but probably one of the worst offenses to the ocean ecosystem is fishing itself. Technology has gotten to the point where a few people with boats and really huge nets can go out and capture a huge amount of fish. And there's a book called The Empty Ocean by Richard Ellis, in which he plots the numbers. They've been keeping track of the catch of ocean pelagic fish since 1950. Plotting it, he says that all fish in the ocean will be commercially extinct by 2048. So, and this has already played out in some cases. In 1992, North Atlantic cod was commercially extinct because the Canadian fishermen off Newfoundland didn't have any restraint and pulled in their biggest catches just years before the cod went commercially extinct. So the ocean is a limiting. The other thing, of course, is that climate change, which is the pollution of the atmosphere with greenhouse gases beyond the atmosphere's ability to assimilate that, to absorb that waste, leads to wildfires, drought, storms, and all of these things then are going to have an effect on our ability to produce food for people. So climate change, limiting factor. Extinction of species. This is a nice image of where land mammals by weight. And the vast majority of all mammals on Earth now are either human in the dark gray or they're domesticated animals. We can't go beyond 100% depletion. You can't go beyond extinction, so that's another limit. And I thought of another one while I was making these slides, and that is that we can't live infinitely long. The life expectancy doubled between historic 35-year life expectancy and 20th century reached 70 or so or more, but it's not going to go up to 140. So we're all limited as to how we can grow in numbers and age. And so now I'm going to talk about, if anybody has any questions, by the way, you can put them in the chat, and hopefully Chuck will look at the chat and see if there's any, because otherwise I'll keep going. So the concept of technology-driven growth and limits has led to a different type of model, and it's called systems dynamics. And if you've ever heard of systems dynamics, it might be models like this, where you've got a predator and a prey, and the predator limits the population of the prey. The prey grows as rapidly as it can, like rabbits or krill, and the predator then grows in proportion to how much prey there is, and that's the definition of a case-selected species. They grow up to their food supply, and that limits the prey population. So this is a Lotka-Volterra model for that kind of predator-prey relationship, and you get oscillation behavior of the populations, and that behavior depends on the variables that we set for the inflow and the outflow in this systems dynamics model. So this is just a case for systems dynamics as a good way to measure limits. I'm not the first. Limits to growth, first published in 1972, and then they published a 30-year update in 2004, used systems dynamics to predict population and many other things. Here's an image of their model that they called World 3. And what you see is a bunch of little figures. The blue ones are called stocks, and the dark arrows there are called flows, and the other ones are just equations and variables. And with 16 of the stocks and about 50 of these variables, they were able to predict population, pollution, human services, industrial capital, natural resources, land, life expectancy, and ecological impact. It was very ambitious model. The prediction that came out of that was that population will peak a little earlier than what the UN model says. It's going to be something like 2040, 2050, and that the population will then drop also more than any of the UN-based models predict. So by imposing these limits, by encoding those into a model, they find out that the UN projections are optimistic. Now I will talk about what I did. This is a research talk. I developed a model inspired by World 3, but also inspired by the need to be simpler than that. So World 4 is a model published this year, and it's much simpler. You see exactly four stocks. None of them has population. One of them is called, I call it low tech or high mortality, and that represents the fraction of society, or call it the state of society in historic times, where our population was limited by predators and storms and disease and unrest and famine. And as time goes on and technology advances, we switch to a state of low mortality and high tech, where each of those sources of mortality has been addressed by some technological advance, such as machines, governance, laws, medicine, communication, trade, things that address a mortality or increase our availability of food, increase the carrying capacity. So this is the model for technology, and humanity, the population, is actually an output of a model for the environment, which goes between ecosphere and human sphere. The ecosphere is defined as all of the parts of the environment that are not under human control, and the human sphere, parts of the environment that are under human control. And examples of things not under human control are oil and coal, wild land, because we have not domesticated it yet. And the stability of the climate is something we have not taken full responsibility for. Anything that is part of the wild nature and we have not taken responsibility for falls into the ecosphere. Farming, ranching, and any of these services that were done by the environment and have now been appropriated by humanity are within what's called the human sphere. And then our carrying capacity is a combination of those two things and technology. The carrying capacity is directly proportional to population, and it's a function of the human sphere because more land means more food, and it's a function of technology because more technology means more efficiency, and it's a function of the ecosphere because the services rendered by the environment make farming more stable. Less flooding, less droughts, less fires, and less storms. So these all factor into the carrying capacity. Did I divine the numbers? No, I fit them. Before I go on to the fitting part, this ecosphere, human sphere idea is derived from the community of people. I'm not getting it on the screen in here, but sorry, it's in the background there. What it looks like is that there's a large circle that says ecosphere and then a small circle within it that says human sphere. And it's from Mathis Wackernagel and William Rees, and these people have, it is on Zoom, yes. And these are, I think, visionaries that are trying to understand the flows of energy and materials in the world. It's called ecological footprint analysis. So I didn't come up with the ecosphere, human sphere concept. I'm using that. So anyhow, that's my model. The take-home message is it's the features of this World 4 that were not in previous models is now growth is driven by technology And so it's intrinsically hyper exponential growth, and there's a limit on the population that goes through the carrying capacity. That's also new. So let's look at the model a little bit. And if we look at these areas here, we've got high mortality, and you've got the ecosphere, and there's feedbacks there summarized on the right. So let's say human sphere goes up. Then that means humanity, population is going up. Our impact on the environment means that ecosphere is going down. The loss of those ecological services, such as carbon sequestration or stability of the climate against storms and fires, the loss of that means that climate stability goes down. Climate stability leads to going to a higher mortality rate, mostly I think because it's going to affect food production. So more of the planet now goes to a higher mortality rate. And then that creates a cycle, because if the mortality goes up, then human sphere goes down, and the arrows flip. And if population goes down, ecosphere recovers, nature recovers, climate stability recovers, and then the mortality rate will go down. If it was that simple, what we would have is this Latka Volterra predator-prey. It's not really predator-prey, but it's kind of like humans are the predator on nature. So in that sense, I guess you could say it's predator-prey. But you would have this oscillation. But there's another wrinkle to this, and that is that human sphere grows intrinsically, and also technology grows intrinsically. If you plug those two things in, you get a different shape of the plot, and it looks more like this. It goes up, and there's a peak, and then it goes down. It's a damped Latka Volterra oscillation. It's going to oscillate about once or 1.5 times. So that's intrinsic to the model. That's not a prediction yet. That's what the model produces because of the feedback system that's encoded in the model. The next step was to fit this model to data, and using population data. And the population data over the last 100 years is fairly accurate. It's plus or minus 3% or so, and that's in this dark blue line here in the B panel. And then the parameters that go into the model are things like, what's the total biocapacity of the planet? What's the starting human population? What's the sensitivity of the environment to the loss of ecosystem? That was the most complex part of this. I had to draw a sigmoid curve and make a parameter for that. And I'm sparing you that complexity. But you have to have some kind of equation that's the feedback of the ecosystem on the mortality rate. So that's in the model. So those numbers couldn't be pulled out of thin air. They have to be fit. And in panel D, what you see is that if I change those parameters, I get a different fit to the present, and I get a different prediction for the future. So the fitting here, this is showing 2-parameter plots of how good the fit is. The best fit part is in purple versus those 2 variables. And I did 2 variables at a time, but I could do many variables by just doing 2 at a time. There were only about 5 or 6 that really mattered. The other ones only affect the past, and one of them only affects the future. So those were not fit. What came out of that? This is the plot that ended up in the paper. Lots of uncertainty. But one thing that seems to be clear about the future is that their global population will peak soon. It does seem like it will peak soon, or according to this model, some of the runs already peaked. They peaked in 2016 in some of the runs. Could it be that the global population has already peaked? I don't know. But that's what this says. In fact, some of the best fits are to, would predict that the current population is about the same as it was in 2010. I think we don't know. We haven't got the 2020 census data out yet. On the high end, it could be as high as 7.8 billion at this point. So this is a large spread. What does that mean? It means it's uncertainty. These are not different scenarios. They're all business as usual scenarios, but they're business as usual with different variables going in. There's an uncertainty in these variables. One of them, E0, is the total amount of global biocapacity. And depending on what you set that at, the population peaks later and goes higher if you set that number small, and it peaks earlier and goes lower if you set that number large. Sure.
So why is the biocapacity so very?
Question is why is the biocapacity variable? And I think what I want to say is it's uncertain. Why is it uncertain? I don't know. It's been estimated by the footprint literature, Mathis Wackernagel, to be even higher than the highest value that I have there. But I have to go with the fitting, and I have to go with the data. And so in the context of this model, those are the biocapacities. They're within about 50% of the published biocapacity of the planet from the Wackernagel's papers. But it's just that it's uncertain. That's all I can say, I guess. So there's a wide spread here of possible outcomes. I was hoping we would have the 2020 census data, and we could then fit to that data and see where it's going to go. We don't have that. Here's what that looks like, by the way, with the superimposed on the UN models here. The peak is lower, is sooner and lower than any of the models, including World 3. The reason that World 4 has a lower peak is threefold. One is that I modeled population growth as technology driven. I also modeled population as tied directly to carrying capacity, and I forgot the third thing. Yeah. So, but this means that I have different equations going in than World 3. We both used systems dynamics, but so now let's look at what happens if I'll speculate on what the 2020 census would produce. It could be that we're going to get the number that's extrapolated from the 2010, and we'll go up 0.8 of a billion in 10 years. And if we do that, and if I add that number to the numbers that I'm fitting, then there's still some uncertainty, but we're going to end up at a higher population. If we think that it's really that the population has already peaked and the global population is now about 7 billion, then we'll have a less happy outcome for humans. But there's still quite a wide range there. So those are what I call business as usual models. That's if we do nothing. So that's if we just continue in the behavior that has led to the current population data, just extrapolating from that. That's the naive way forward. What if we look at policy changes? What is going to happen then? So it's wonderful to have a mathematical model, because now you can say, I'm going to impose a policy change, and it's a feeling of power. You have full control over this model. Policy change may or may not be something we can actually do, but we can at least model it. In this scenario, inspired from E.O. Wilson's book, Half Earth, he said, save half the earth and we will save civilization. So I can do that. So I controlled the value for this arrow here, which is the rewilding of human domesticated land, human domesticated biocapacity back to the ecosphere, and looked at what would happen if you did that to the point where ecosphere was granted half of the total Earth's biocapacity. So if you do that, if you anywhere above 43% of wild land dedicated to nature will lead to a much better outcome for humans than if we saved less than that. Interestingly, there seems to be a cutoff about between 35% and 43%, where we go from a low population future regime to a high population future. So maybe something we should think about. And that's a segue to the next part. Here's the idea, the rewilding. Rewilding is just not using land, letting things go fallow. If you do that, it gets taken over by nature, and the nature's ecological services are helped by that. They'll, for instance, sequester carbon for us, and we don't have to do it by geoengineering. Here's another way. Sure. How much of the world is wild now? I think it's about half, but I can't remember where I read that. I think it was something like that.
You say wild, you mean it's not, there's no man.
I think I would go to my model and say, if you fit the population data as accurately as you can, and then take out of the model the ecosphere and the human sphere, where are they now? And if I do that, then that's my answer is about 50%. And yeah, but we can recover. So if we stopped right now, we probably can't just put the brakes on and just stop. But as time goes on, we can recover that land. We can rewild it. So, and at least in the model, I don't know if we can do it in reality, but did I cover that well enough? Here, what I did was ramp up rewilding gradually over X number of years, anywhere from 30 to 50 years. And I had it starting from random time points between 1990 and 2020. And so that's why you see different curves, some of them curving up faster than others and more than others. I also had another parameter called the enforcement parameter, and that varied from, I think, 50% to 90% enforcement. That's just how much the model forced that policy to be enacted. So anyhow, how do we rewild? And maybe one of the ways to do it is to decrease the population of people coming in. So I am in my real job as a biologist is to design vaccines. And it occurred to me some time ago that you could use vaccines as a contraceptive. It's been used for animals for years, and there's a contraceptive vaccine in clinical trials in India. There's lots of advantages to using a vaccine over hormones or last-minute measures. It's very much hands-off, and so why hasn't this been done? I asked myself, and as soon as I asked that question, I perused the literature and I found out that there were people doing it, and I connected with them, and I'm indebted to Rajesh Nas and K.I. Talwar for starting this project, and I just took it the next step. So this is a project done by my lab, which you see up here, and a group in Yale University led by Jean-Ju Chung, who's a sperm expert. and funded by a billionaire who does not want his name to be known. So I'll just call him the Foundation. Yeah, and he's a great guy. He really wants to save the. You can see in the subtext of the name of the foundation, for the protection of the environment. And it's interesting how I met this guy. His CEO attended a conference that I went to, and I was in the audience, but the panel asked me to say something about the contraceptive vaccine, and I ranted about how there was no funding to work on contraception. And the CEO of this foundation was right behind me and said, "Can we do lunch?" And that's how it started. So it's very, very, fortuitous. So anyhow, why work on contraception? Because almost half of all pregnancies in the world are unwanted right now. They're unintended. And when asked by this group called the Guttmacher Institute, some percentage, 27% say they didn't want to have a baby now, 18% said they didn't want to have a baby at all. None of those would have babies if contraception was 100% effective. So, and there's reason to believe that's an underestimate. There's actually a published paper saying Guttmacher underestimated it, and it might be even greater than 50% of pregnancies are not intended. Much of these are from young women. There's a cycle of poverty. If you are an unwanted child, you're likely not to escape poverty, and then if you are in poverty, you're likely to have also unwanted children due to many of the forces. This paper talks about the correlations and the causalities of the different aspects of poverty that lead to just perpetuating poverty by having larger families. So saving the environment is one thing, but also saving people is a really, I think, a good motivation for working on this project. This is the summary of the whole project right here. My colleague Jean-Ju Chung works on sperm, and she's identified proteins on the tail of the sperm that are essential for its activity, for its fertility. We identified on the surface of those proteins antigens that can be made into, these are called epitopes, which can then be placed on the surface of a carrier here, and that carrier could be injected into females or men or women, and they develop immunity, and the antibodies that are raised by that immunity will bind to this protein and will block that hyperactivity. So that's our plan, and the advantages are it's long-term. As long as the immunity lasts, you don't have to do anything. It's cheap to make a vaccine. It's hands-off to be protected against pregnancy. There's no action that needs to be taken. There's not expected to be any side effects because it's based on an existing vaccine technology that's been used for years and is widely used across the whole world. It's called Gardasil, and it's reversible because we can block the antibodies that block the sperm. So we're working on it. This is the images from Jean-Ju's lab where she's distinguishing between the type of motility that's normal for sperm and the type of motility that's required for it to penetrate the egg. This type of motility can be blocked by antibodies. So what we did is design what my student calls a sheep in wolf's clothing, which is it's a sperm protein, but you put it on a carrier that tricks the immune system into thinking that it's a dangerous thing. And then the immune system raises the alarm and makes antibodies against that thing, which it turns out to be proteins from the sperm. And that those are expressed throughout the body, including the mucosa, including the vaginal mucosa, and they will block the sperm and stop it from getting to the egg. And we're here's some of the latest results. We've proven that it works in mice. We haven't done any work in primates or humans yet, but that's coming up shortly, I hope. And we're scaling up production. We're producing it in deep culture using yeast. And we think that it's safe because it's based on a current technology, and we're working on the methods to reverse it. We're also working on a rapid test to see if a woman has been immunized against pregnancy, she can do a little rapid test to see if she's currently infertile or fertile. And we'll work on that technology too. It's a lot of fun to work on something that you really think is going to have an impact. So this is to say, it'll have an impact, but even if our method doesn't work, there's reason to hope. Fertility is going down very quickly right now. This is an infographic. I love infographics. They tell you a lot. And what you're seeing here is time in the color spectrum here, from red to yellow to blue, and fertility in the y-axis, going measured in terms of number of children per woman. And then each of these line segments here is a country. And so the long horizontal segments, like our China, account for a larger fraction of the total world population. And what do you see? Well, here's China in 1950. Here's China way down at 3 in 1975. And then there's China below 2 in 2005. China is at negative fertility. It's below replacement, and it has been for years now. Likewise, India in the 50s had a fertility rate almost of 6 children per woman. That's going down. It went down less dramatically than China, but it's now approaching that magic number 2, which is the replacement value. In the US, was not as high, but that's also going down. So you see this, the fertility across the world is dropping. We're just going to help it, that's all. And I'd like to end with a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King. Unlike the plagues of the Dark Ages or contemporary diseases, which we do not understand, the modern plague of overpopulation is soluble by means we have discovered and with resources we possess. What is lacking is not sufficient knowledge of the solution, but universal consciousness of the gravity of the problem and the education of billions of people who are its victims. Thanks so much. Yeah.
Okay, so not only announcement, but people could chat questions in the chat.
Okay. If anybody has questions, please either unmute or put them in the chat. And you guys can also unmute.
The concept of technology being, such a enabler of the population growth, have we hit an inflection point with our technology? Because our technology is now causing an increase in mortality with, climate change, all our pollution, all of that. Does that factor into your model too?
Yeah, something I forgot to get back to was that, so I said tech. I think did you hear it? Okay, so the question is technology also reaching an inflection point? Is it turning around? And I lean on my model a lot. I can follow it on the model. It's really hard to pin down something else, somebody else's some graph on Google Images but in the model it will reach a peak and then turn around. And the explanation for why that is so is that technology becomes obsolescent when it's no longer applicable. For instance, buggy whip technology, now that we have cars, is a lost technology. So technology that works now for farming might not work in a climate change world. So we'll have to, so we've lost that technology. It's obsolescent, so that it's going down. We have to come up, we need a new solution. So if technology is defined as things which contribute to the carrying capacity, anything that no longer works means that's lost. That's a segment of technology that's lost, has to be recovered again. So having coded that into the model, technology peaks and then goes down. So doesn't mean we've lost the existing technology. It means it's not effective anymore. Any questions from the Zoom people?
Just to let you know, there were 24 people on Zoom.
Yes.
24 people cited and some people, 2 people cited. It was about 30 people.
Great.
I have a question, maybe I missed something here, but I mean, it's all great information, but, so population looks like it's declining, and that's, it makes perfect sense. And I understand about trying to increase or decrease the infertility because, well, I totally get that with the, people being born into a bad life. But in the long-term scheme of things, how are we going to reverse the population growth? In other words, every model showing it's going downward. Maybe that's not a bad thing, but I think as mankind, I would think that in the future that would be scary, especially that those numbers really drop. What's going to change it to go the other way, if anything? Or is that just the way it is?
Your question, what's going to change and make it go back up?
Right. I mean,
okay.
Not the infertility thing. I mean, that's a really interesting concept.
So
in the climate change as well, where that's going.
I think what is going to change is that as the population goes down, the changes that we've made to the ecosystem are going to get reversed. There'll be regrowing of forests. So climate change will, it will be slow to recover, but as farms become more forests, more carbon is now going back out of the atmosphere. And so that will further cool the planet and freeze the Arctic, but those are slow. Yeah. Another thing that is going to turn population around after it's gone down is that the food supply is sufficient for fewer people. So as there's fewer people to feed, there's less shortage. So those are the natural cycles that will happen. It is, worrisome, but I do think that it's not going to be. It's going to be the end of a lot of worry that population growth has made us concerned for what it's going to do to the planet. Population decline is scary in itself, but we're going to be having a different narrative. It's now not going to be, when does population stop growing? What do we do about population growth? It's going to be, how do we navigate this? It's going to be a problem with the economy, which is built on a growth mentality. How do we have an economy that doesn't depend on growth? So there'll be different problems, and it's hard to predict the future, but it'll be a different world. It will?
The wild card is the climate change, how quickly things.
Right, and if climate change could come to a point where it's no longer reversible. Yeah. But I just believe that it's better to know what can happen in the future rather than not know it. Not knowing something is the scariest thing. Thank you. And thanks everybody for showing up
I
here.
have a,
Oh, can you just unmute? Oh, okay. Hi, Barb.
Chris, can you hear me?
We're not hearing you, Barb, so I can turn on
All right.
this.
That's okay.
I can't do that.
I have a question that I submitted
Can you hear?
in writing.
No, I'm going to do this. I'm going to turn off my. Can you hear me? Oh,
Yeah.
try again.
I put in the chat.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Says, do any models show us going extinct?
Do any models show us going extinct? I'm getting an echo. No. If I push the model as much as I can, I give it numbers that should drive us to extinction, it doesn't happen. There's too much of a feedback in the system that when population goes low, all the limits are gone, and limits drive population. So the limit, as long as the population limit doesn't reach zero, the population doesn't reach zero. But what's not factored in is a lot of other stuff. For instance, I have no factoring in of politics, right? I don't know how to do that yet. I'm working on it. I'm thinking there are papers that correlate like food prices with unrest. So there might be a way to do that, and it's going to be very, very rough. But without that, if in a business as usual model population, the humans don't go extinct. I don't see the chat.
Chris, can you see my chat?
Okay, go ahead and read it.
Says, assuming you can develop a contraceptive vaccine that is approved, what percent of the population would be willing to be vaccinated?
What percentage of the population would be willing to be vaccinated? That's I don't want to give it a cop-out answer, but that's I'm working on the technology, but to address that, we're going to have to do marketing.
Yes.
So you want to get that to as all the people that need it. Marketing is the specialty of a group some of you know called the Population Media Center. And they center on population-related issues and getting people to change their minds about things like contraception. And so my marketing future of this would be to partner with Population Media Center and try to put friendly messages about a contraceptive vaccine into radio dramas and TVs and stories. And I'm willing to go around and talk about it, but I don't think I'm a scientist. I'm not the best messenger for this. So we'd want to get, actors involved. But the short answer is it's I don't know, but it's going to be a marketing issue.
Here's a positive comment, and thanks, Chris, for a brilliant, thought-provoking presentation. It was very encouraging despite some bad news. Population in the decline is good news.
Population decline, I know among those of us that are involved in the degrowth group, population decline is considered a good thing. And I think that's something that the people need to make aware, we need to increase awareness of that if population is the root cause of a lot of the problems we have, then decline in population is a good thing. Oh, it's gonna, you know, a peaceful decline is even better. I mean, it's the only way, and nobody is proposing anything but a peaceful decline. So I think my daughters are not going to have kids. A lot of people are opting for the child-free life, and as long as we're voluntarily doing it, I think I see a good future. Thank you for that nice comment. Oh, she said she put it in the chat. Okay. Oh, okay.
I have another question.
Well,
Can you hear me?
thanks everybody.